State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
All right, welcome to the Black Myths Podcast. Welcome to the Black Myths Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. So I broke my promise. I said we were going to do X-Men. That is on its way, but scheduling. Been a lot of scheduling issues this year. So we're returning to talk about my co-authored book, Laundering Black Rage. So the last episode we had done a few months ago was on the myth that the state is the government, or the government is the state, as in like those two things are synonymous. So we are extending on that conversation, but we are chapter 3 of Laundering Black Rage talks about cities as one of the main pillars of laundering. So today we're going to talk about cities, which we were supposed to talk about that last episode, but we talked so long we never got around to it. So the myth is a little different. It's still in lieu of the state as the government, but it's more so specific to cities. So it's about whose streets, and you'll hear that often in chants and protests when people are trying to reclaim space. And this is no knock on that chant. It's just more so this idea that cities belong to us because we live in them. And under capitalism, it's just not that simple. We don't simply by living somewhere, occupying somewhere, does not mean that those things belong to us, because capitalism, privatizes things, and the rest of us are just laborers to maintain that, to maintain those enclosures, right? So similar to labor, where, workers offer their labor power for a given amount of time. They don't own the workplace simply because they live there. So just like cities, just because you live in one does not mean it's your streets. But this is this common misconception that it's our city, because we live here. And that's, as we deal with in the laundering, I don't want to get into the conversation too much. That's just not exactly how cities have been conceived under the concept of capitalism. So I would refer people to the book Laundering Black Rage, and also refer people to Rasul's first book that's specifically about cities, geographies of threat. I would refer people to that as well if you want to get a better understanding. This conversation, or this episode, is more conversational than it is an interview. It is somewhat of an interview, but it's also more conversational because we're both talking about just some of the themes that have maybe didn't make the book, but stuff that we're still thinking about around cities. So it's a little bit unorthodox for this show, but I think it's a good deep dive into understanding, like, spatially, how to understand and think through the dynamics around us that incorporates all of us into the laundering. And cities are one of the primary ways that that's done. Lastly, before we get into the episode, I want to shout out a few of the patrons, or shout out the few patrons who signed up. So Watt and Axmed, who just signed up in the last few weeks. Shout out to them. I see we have a few free members. I will start shouting those out, the free members who signed up, but this section is mainly for people who paid, but I will shout those out. So Chadrick, Alan, I see as well, signed up, Lucid. So shout out to y'all too, because we still appreciate all the support. Beyond that, this is part 1 and 2. So a part 1 and part 2, but this entire conversation will immediately be on Patreon for once I actually will hold my promise on that. So if you want to hear the entire conversation now, go to Patreon. For those who aren't members, you can hear this week and then the rest of it next week. So today we're going to revisit the state, government myth, give you some breakdown of how cities incorporate this into laundering, and then the next episode deals more maybe what to do about that situation and how to overcome it. So appreciate it, and we'll be back for another episode, and we'll be back with the X-Men So thank you. All right. So we back to do this episode that was originally the myth was the state is the government. And I think we went pretty deep on that. So if people still have issues, then they should probably just go follow the references that were named in the episode. Um, but for those who didn't, here with Rasul, could you briefly explain, just to reiterate briefly why the state is not reducible to the government, and more importantly, really why that distinction matters? Why is that an important distinction to make?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And and again, to probably encourage people to uh listen to those past episodes that we sort of dealt with that. I don't want to try to rehash some of those points and some of those analogies. But I think um first to sort of answer your question in a way, why have people sort of sought to explain something that creates dominance and control, and why did they come to sort of explain that dominance and control, having some type of mechanism or framework called the state over it? And so I think on one end, the attempt, especially by Marx, but also Marxists, it was a way to sort of broaden what's the dynamic between the tensions between an owner and the workers, especially when you begin to see differentiation in levels of, you know, owners, based upon the size of the business and the factory, how many people who can work in that space, but also what begins to happen when those owners wishes to control more and more of their workers' everyday life, right? And so
Beyond just the workplace.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So it's
yeah.
one thing to control. I mean, we're talking about a time period when there was no 9 to 5. So beyond just simply controlling when people could take a break, could they use the bathroom, during work? I know I'm sounding like I'm explaining Amazon in the present, but try to think about the present, without even any laws to even be angry at, like
Yeah.
just the simple notion of coming into work and not knowing when you're going to get off, right? And then needing to use the bathroom and having to sort of ask for permission, and having the differences in who would grant permission based upon their perception of supervision, right? And what would happen to you if you become sick and ill? Would you automatically lose your job? So beyond just the control of a worker during the time period of work, and so you can't say 9 to 5 because the 9 to 5 didn't exist. Um, Ownership also began to seek control of the workers outside of work time, because owners understood that how one engages in their life impacts the workspace.
Mhm.
If they get drunk over the weekend, they may be incapable of coming into work on Monday, you know? So you had some owners seek to own and control taverns or shut down taverns, right? Or have cutoff time periods of the service of alcohol, or whole days in which alcohol is not sort of served. You also had owners sort of find ways in which, you control food. And so, do you allow workers to go elsewhere to, get food, bread, for example, milk, or do you provide that? And then they must in turn sort of pay you from the wages that they've earned from you, to sort of have food. And so now all of a sudden you're controlling more than just the work hours, you're controlling the sort of non-work hours. Um, so this is why people can sort of see the labor movement making these claims of 8 hour workday, 8 hour rest, and 8 hour recreation as their sort of argument points. Like, fair work should have this type of a day, right? So that helps to then move people beyond just thinking about an owner, somebody who just owns a business. You're also owning a person, so this gets us to not free labor, which is slavery, but unfree labor, which is wage dependency. You're dependent upon the wage, and you're dependent upon this type of income, a type of work to do to get the income, to have some basic means like shelter, bread, milk, cheese.
To reproduce yourself, basically. Yeah.
Correct, correct. And so the larger, or the more dominant one, and the owner was, the more expansiveness that they could sort of control that space. So this is where you have the idea of owners creating factory towns and so forth, that still was commonplace even up until the 1950s, 1960s in the United States. It's not a thing that was just in the 1500s. Like, it remained to be a thing in certain places outside of the United States. It's still a thing,
Yeah.
right? Where without the factory, either there would not be a town, or the town would be very inadequate to sort of supply one's basic needs, even if the wages are sort of insufficient to supply a lot of people's basic needs. And so trying to think through that dominance, and then you also think through that there are different levels of people who are earning income. So you have workers at various sort of roles and responsibilities, but then you have managers who aren't owners, and then they're not working on the shop floor.
Right.
And so the state was a way to begin to think about, well, what's the then relationship? What's between these things? How did these things develop? Is there an owner over an owner, right? And the owner, understanding that the owner isn't the king or the queen, the owner isn't parliament. So what's then the relationship, between those things and the owners of a particular business? So the state was a way to sort of explain that, and to explain that then this is who is controlling not just our wage, but also our life. And so I hope that kind of frames. I think there's more that could be said, but I think just kind of, again, trying to explain it in yet another way other than some of our past episode discussions. And so a state was a way to try to explain that dynamic and relationship. And so this is why Marx in particular evolves in his explanation of the state. But then this is also how others either understandably disagree with Marx, or they come up with their own explanation, whether they read Marx or not. And so for me, I try to sort of think through a lineage that ultimately goes to Marx, but not intentionally. It's not like, I want to get to and connect to Marx's original argument. It just happens to be that, just as other people have asked the question, it doesn't make sense that government is the state. If we're thinking about the state as the sort of framework for dominance, and if the framework for dominance is only government, then how is then this factory also a part of the dominance of my life? It's not, it's not, the factory is not the courts. The factory is not the police. The factory is not parliament. So then how is the factory also dominating, right? How is then, if I'm also being pressured into donating to the church and shamed, or I have to pay the church, because in certain cases, depending upon how old the city may be, the church may be the biggest real estate, owner and developer, because of their, they've gotten land from people's sort of wills and testaments. And so you may stay then on church property. And so how then is the church then also dominating my life? These things can't be dominating my life separately, because if they were, then they would be in competition to each other. And there are some levels of disagreement and competition through these, particularly
Tactically speaking.
Yeah, exactly. But they all seem to be in agreement about extraction, right?
And
And so
domination.
and domination. And so
Yeah.
and they then work with each other. And sometimes the disagreements and agreements are based upon the levels of extraction and domination.
Mhm.
And so that's why some people have moved away from just thinking about it's just government. And then these other things are outside of government doing something else. And they either pay off the government, as if they have enough money, as if they print currency, right? Businesses do not print currency at all, right? Uh, and businesses can't protect their factories from an entire town or city of people, right? And so Marx, is one of the more known sort of people that think beyond state government. Gramsci, Rosa Luxemburg, but then also Gramsci, in two different contexts, and thinking about, Italy with Gramsci and Luxemburg moving around a lot of different places because of her life being threatened, everywhere from working out of Germany, but also in France, but also in the UK. Both of them really attempted to think through the dynamics. Who are these forces that then are, coalescing? How do they come together? But then also, how do they contradict each other? And then how do they sort of, again, find ways to agree that's not necessarily coalescing? So they're not trying to form one thing. How are they working in cooperation with one another? And then after sort of Gramsci, so Rosa Luxemburg is more of a later contemporary of Marx, and then Gramsci comes a little bit later. And then, and when I say later, I mean, so, I guess for our listeners, we think about Marx up until 1880s, 1890s, and we think about, Luxemburg, 1870s. So there's some overlap, to the early 1910s. And then we think about Gramsci, like late 1910s to, 1930s. Not in terms of their whole life. I'm talking about
Their
some of
intellectual kind of thought.
yeah, exactly. And then one of the people who really appreciated Gramsci's writing was Stuart Hall, from the United Kingdom. And, he begins to think about this further because he's part of a movement of academics, public intellectuals, and activists who are trying to look at what's happening in Britain in 1950s, right? Because they're recognizing that while the crown has a diminished role in governance and there is parliament, they don't hold sway in everyday life. It's the newspapers, and it's the burgeoning TV that's not just the news. It's the radio stations that are dictating what type of music is being played. And at this particular time, they're really controlling American rock, because they see American rock as deviant. There's this whole idea of pirate radio in the UK, because who is trying to prevent rock from being played in the UK, because it's not just the music itself. It's not just a taste issue. Like, we don't want to hear these loud guitars. It's also the inherent possibilities of political sort of dissent that's inherent in rock because of, one, the how aesthetically sort of the music sounds, but also the lyrics that could be associated with it. So they truly tried to bar it. So people like Stuart Hall were beginning to sort of look at, well, then how they were restricting access to that type of material and content, and then trying to come up with or elevate this heightened new type of content. So it's wild that we have this praise of Bridgerton, in the present day. And I know that's just incredible that we're mentioning Bridgerton on Black Miss,
Yeah, I
podcast.
didn't see that one coming, but
Yeah, but it's important, because there's a time period in which, well, one, it's interesting that one, it's not UK people who are creating Bridgerton, it's United States people who are creating this. But Bridgerton, as a sort of attitude and look, was a part of this, mod, the young lads, this sort of notion of bringing back certain tastes and attitudes of Victorian England as being the preferred cultural custom. So they were trying, so UK was trying to use BBC TV and BBC radio to re-educate the populace, especially working class, to value Victorian attitudes, which didn't work. People were pushing back because working class people couldn't, didn't have access to it, or they were working, the sort of spaces in which these elites were having their free time and their, luxury in. And so people in British culture were pushing for just dissent and radicalism, or they were trying to leave, the United Kingdom, like the Beatles, right? Like
right.
they're not just coming over here because they love the fanfare. They can't really sort of become big and perform the music that they wish to perform in the way that they perform it, because it wasn't going to be kind of allowed, in the UK. So uh so the cultural studies was then saying, now then there's this whole media structure that's not the church, that's not government, that's not technically corporate entities, because when they're thinking about corporate, they're thinking about people who run like natural gas, oil.
Yeah, the kind of
you know,
means of production type.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So media was this major new entity beyond just a newspaper, because before the newspaper was a part of the fourth estate
that was
counter.
the
Yeah,
propaganda. Yeah,
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 yeah. And so Stuart Hall and them were, learning from Gramsci and then trying to expand the state even more, and showing how that there is this dynamic and relationship between these forces to then create the dominance on our social life. So and so, I appreciate Stuart Hall. I look towards him. Maybe I look to him way too much, but so what? I guess we all have to have our faults. And I guess that's a good, that's a fine enough thought for me to have, because
There's worse people to refer to all the time.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So I hope that kind of gives a framework for why thinking about the state as being more than just government. And I wanted to try to answer it, just to kind of recap how we got here. I just want to try to answer it in a way of, why did even people try to pursue answering it as bigger than government? Because they were trying to find some explanation for the forces that were dominating themselves.
Man, I think I brought up Lenin last time. I can't remember what you said, but I
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
I don't want to get too deep into state and revolution, but I know the very beginning of the book he talks about it arose because of irreconcilable class
right.
antagonisms, right? Like, so you have these different interests, and you need. I don't know if he was fully reaching for the same kind of framework that you're describing, or even Gramsci, but the idea of a state that is trying to regulate on some level different like antagonisms that aren't, like he said, that cannot be reconciled. Like, you can't really reconcile the relationship between a worker and a boss in a way
Right.
where each side walks away with a fair amount, because the relationship in and of itself is always gonna lend credence to the boss. Like, even if you get paid a higher wage or
Yeah.
whatever, like, you're always being exploited. You're not getting the true value of your labor.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
appreciate you bringing that up, because yeah, exactly. Because most fundamental aspect of Marx is conflict theory, which is, history is based upon the tension and conflict between the owners and the workers, right? And this is not just a bias to like think about only worker, but like, no, it really literally makes sense. If someone is dominating your ability to sustain oneself, and they will not sustain you equitably and justly, you're gonna be in conflict. And then
Yeah.
on the other end, if you own and people who work for you, or do work for you ain't gonna act right, you're gonna, apply force. And so historically, there's then always, it's going to be tension forever and ever as long as that structure is in place. And so so Lenin is important alongside Gramsci, but the only difference between the two is Gramsci was limited to articulating his ideas locked up in prison in a cell,
Right.
because he was trying to create dissent and trying to do political education. And of course, he's noticing that there's these different forces. It wasn't just government that came after him. It was also people who should have been more on his side, but wasn't, because part of the more liberal traditions were also a part of seeking to imprison him. Whereas Lenin, while having bouts with interactions with the law, uh, he is not then kept in prison and assists in the revolution.
Yeah, and I think when people talk about seizing the state, I've been reading more, rereading a lot and reading new stuff on the Cuban Revolution. But what was interesting with them, and even with the Russian Revolution, was it's not that sees the state thing becomes reduced to government, and then that leads to this logic. Well, you could just elect people or something like that because the state is just government. Well, therefore I can just make Rasul president. But if you try to actually seize the state, that's why you need labor really on your side, because
Right.
it is in a way is a recognition, even if people aren't explicitly saying it, that we can't really seize the state by simply just taking over a government, because if labor has no real say in this, if the workers have nothing to say in it, then what can we do? So like it's no coincidence that Castro calls a mass strike to
Mm.
officially
Mm.
enter into the revolution. Like that's, and now I was reading the hidden history of the Cuban Revolution. He talks about like that was important because that helped keep away a military, just another military coup, which like the strike, because it put the people in power in a way that if the military just takes over the state, you know, like that's not gonna lend to what Cuba ultimately was trying to become. So
Yeah, and I guess just thinking through some of the listeners, just a mass strike or a general strike. So what is that? So think of a strike as something that's localized to an occupation, or a group of people in several different types of occupational positions at one sort of space. So
yeah,
one type of factor. So think of just a strike as one of those two things. All teachers, all public school teachers in the city, or the public
McDonald's
school teachers.
workers
Right,
or
right, right. All the
yeah,
dock workers,
yeah.
for this one shipping company,
Yeah.
right? So that's a strike.
The bus drivers or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But then a mass strike or general strike is when you have other people in other working occupations then supporting the efforts of that localized strike, thereby forcing the entire system to respond to not just those people who are striking around their issue, but all the issues.
Everything.
Because exactly, because if all the teachers in the city don't want to come to work because of not just fair pay, but also conditions for their students and so forth. And then all of a sudden you have firefighters and you have plumbers and you have bus drivers, and you have all these other occupations that are saying, well, we're not going to come to work either. Our children go to school and so forth. You're going to have, the city council, mayor, somebody now needing to listen to the demands, because the whole, major parts of the city are shut down because it's a mass strike or general strike. really hard thing clearly to organize. And it requires conditions to be so bad that, of course, everyday people come in. It's not just the hardliners who believe in it.
And Cuba Batista's regime had gotten that violent, even though Batista had actually fled like early or like in 58, and then like January 59 is when they did the mass strike. But that regime had gotten so violent that it did bring in the regulars. It wasn't just like, to your point about the hardliners. Like
Yeah.
that's what I mean. Like they had there were different. I don't want to get into the Cuban Revolution too deeply, but there was like
Yeah, right.
there was different factions. A lot of people think it was just dudes in a mountain or something, but there was like different factions, and labor was one of those main factions.
Right. And of course, I mean, I know you mentioned the mountains, but it's our classic sort of offline sort of example of, revolution then becomes this romantic sort of idea of, the shining of a gun in a basement or shining a gun on some mountain range, and we're gonna get these people type of thing. And it's like, no, like the conditions are so bad that there is no other thing to go to. But it's not just a response to being angry at the conditions. It's now a desire to say we have the capacity to do better than the structure that's over us.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to then put that structure, that idea into practice. We don't know if it's going to work, but whatever could be better than what we have.
Yeah.
And so so that's beyond just this sort of desire to shoot a weapon or desire to somehow look bad in a photo. It's like people are incapable of feeding themselves, people are incapable of housing themselves, people are incapable of accessing clean water to such a degree that they're seeking something else, because they know that there's no other recourse. They've done everything else. They've tried to appeal to the owner. They tried to appeal to the church. They tried to appeal to the parliament. And everywhere they've gone, they've gotten nothing that would sort of resolve the issues at play, either in their social life or in their sort of work conditions.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for that. I think I hopefully, again, if y'all need more than that, I don't know what to tell you. But,
I'm sure we'll always have to keep explaining that, that position and idea, man.
yeah, for the lifetime of the book.
Yeah.
So a quote from the book, you say, because this episode really is to deal with cities, you say, but in the work of Laundering Black Rage, the city is also the laundromat of the state. The roads and interstates for circulation capital are invisible to us as they appear to us as boulevards and highways in their role as circulators of produced capital. They cleanse the money of extracted labor, stolen lands, and wars of occupation, and then turn that money into capital, labor into commodities, and propaganda into culture. So how does laundering, as we define it in the book, fit into this conception of the state?
So it's good that we kind of open in the way that we open. So if we think about, let's say, work life and social life. So work life, in a workplace, what are the things that could be put into place to, one, ensure that workers work for the hours that they're supposed to work, as much as possible. And so we're seeing some of that now, where there was once this phase of, the ideal workplace where you have, remote working, you have the zip line in the office, you have the nap room, you have the
This
sort
is
of,
this is that big tech shit.
yeah, the wet bar,
Yeah.
you have the child care, you
Mhm.
have dry cleaning, you have Uber Eats inside the factory, where people delivering food to your desk from the cafeteria place with chefs in there. And so these are some ways to, create a work life. And we were so enamored by those things. Oh, it would be so neat to work in those places, not thinking that they're actually wanting you to work more, right? You're going to stay at the office longer because of those amenities, because they become flexible. So that now, yeah, you could take a nap during the day at your workplace in the tree house. And I'm not lying that there are offices with tree houses with nap rooms, right? Still,
Silicon Valley is notorious for what you're describing.
yeah,
So
yeah, you know, and
yeah,
so yeah, and so now because you've taken a nap at work, you've tacked on 3 more hours of being away from home or family or wherever else. Because it's not like you don't take a nap and then go home. Like you have to finish your project. And so, your meditation room with the fish tank or whatever else, you leave that and you go back to your desk and you finish your project. And you decide to work there at that place because how cool it would be, how nice it would be to sort of work in that environment, not thinking that they're holding you to more work, right? And so that's a work life, designing a work life to ensure that people keep working. And so then what do you then do? So if we can think of those types of amenities, because we know plenty of us work in spaces that don't have all that, right? And how much we don't want to work, in those spaces. Like we're constantly looking at the clock because we don't have a zip line and we don't have a tree house and and we don't
ain't no
have
food, ain't no bar, ain't no salad bar or something. Yeah,
no. And and when there is like a staff luncheon, it's not a part of your hours, or you got some dry sandwich that makes
that you
Subway
might have
sandwiches,
brought to work yourself.
yeah, that makes Subway sandwiches taste savory, right? So
Right.
and so but we see that. I mean, we more recently we've seen the sort of more workplaces now even eroding those workplace incentives, right? Most recently with in terms of those two banks that have already been looking at they own the laptop or desktop that you use for work, and they've been clocking your keystrokes, and so they know like how much you've been typing and if you've been typing real stuff or gibberish. And so like in the past month, there's already been layoffs at two major banks. I just can't think of two because I didn't come prepared to talk about it. I'm just sort of speaking on it right now, presently, that there was already layoffs because they were looking at people's keystrokes, especially for those who are working remotely, right? And because they're accusing the workers of time theft. And time theft for our listeners is when workers are supposedly getting paid for work during a set amount of time, but instead of working, they're doing
Wells
solitaire.
Fargo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know Wells Fargo was one, but I know it was then there was another bank that also, came out right after the Wells Fargo announcement.
Yeah, the Wells Fargo was about a week ago.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if there was any others, but I know that was like in the Guardian and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And but anyway, the work life, so we have an understanding of work lives that are, workspaces that creates a work life that are undesirable. And then we have a sense or imagination now of a work life that is desirable, that then creates a work life, right? This is the place where you have, friends in the office space, and you have time to talk and all these types of things. So we think about that in that regards, and then we think about a social space and social life. So if we think about uh, we need a social space that's similar to that sort of ideal workspace. So just like you have chutes and ladders and and zip lines and birthday cakes and so forth in the workspace, in your social life, you need to have farmers markets and wine tasting and Pilates classes and these types of things, because otherwise the social space is intolerable for you to choose to live there for work. People think about schools for their children and think about maybe religious institutions that they want to sort of go to when they're thinking about places to move to for those people who have the option and ability to pick the places
So
that.
you're saying that the workplace that you were describing earlier, that it provides all these amenities at the job, that is mirroring basically how, and this is a question, how the rest of society works even when you leave, where you still have all these amenities to kind of complement the work. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so yeah. So I appreciate your clarity, because I am saying that, even though that's not what I was initially thinking about how to explain it, but absolutely, in the sense that what I'm getting ready to explain is how social space creates social life, right? For us to tolerate living in the conditions that we live in, workspaces have, then started to become smarter and also then imitated than social spaces in the workspace to then have people create a work life, right? You remove then these aspects of a workspace that are amenable, like, again, remote work, um, bathroom breaks, sick leave, these types of things. It makes then work life less and less tolerable. But the work life, we would think that the work life influenced the social space, but no, I'm arguing that it's the social space that created more ways to fine tune the workspace. And that's because the social space is in direct relationship to the creation of a city. First of all, levels of spaces in which people live in reflect different levels of not only domination, but also what can be done there. So a simple settlement, even though we're so far, in history away from settlement periods where, it's a people who go out to some area that's not even really developed yet, and they just set up some makeshift, infrastructure to live in, whether it's tents or cabins or whatever else. And all they can do is just go to the pond and fish, or go to the woods and hunt. And you may have multiple tents and multiple cabins interconnected to have a small community. But that settlement was, one of the more fundamental ways in which different colonial empires were able to spread out. Because remember, colonialism is not you going to a territory right next to your empire. It's about you going to a completely other space, right? Because colonialism wouldn't just be right next door. Colonialism is always about, expansion farther. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a different thing when you're just going across the border right next to you, right? You don't have to be an empire to do that, right? So, uh, so a settlement is that size. A village doesn't necessarily imply government, and sometimes a village may create systems in which everyday people have greater control over the social space and social life above the governance, right? Because a village doesn't have to necessarily have government representatives to exist. It could just be a larger collection of those cabins, right? And I know in certain, places, depending upon the listeners, there may be the term village in the present day, like the village of Muhammad or the village of, Pike or whatever, right? But those are technically maybe, really the term used as a way to demarcate size of the population, but they really are just small cities, right?
It's more of a colloquial.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm talking about village in a very old classical sense that still exists in certain countries, in certain spaces. And then a town is when you start to see larger development of uh, different entities, especially governmental representation, right? With a town, because may have a small town court system, small town sort of law enforcement system, a small town sort of government system, maybe a town leader, and so forth, right? Or a town mayor. So a city means something that's way more expansive, but not just because it's expansive, because there's more people that have chosen to live there, because people really kind of don't choose to live um, in any particular place, right? Cities are representations of where people are pushed to, or pushed out of, or attracted and pulled into.
Okay,
Because
before we
sorry,
that
yeah,
that's history I want to touch on in a different, like getting into cities and enclosures,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
want to
yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
bracket that somewhere else.
Cool. But still to the point about the cities and why is it set up laundering so well?
Yeah.
It's about that social space. So it's about the whole notion of, so if the city was stripped of just having your dwelling, a road to work, so you leave home after, once you wake up, you go to work and you come back, that, no matter how good the workspace is, the social space isn't good enough to put up with, up with living in that sort of city environment. So a city creates enough space in which you can have more articulations of what you can do when you're not at work, and beyond just the sort of social obligatory spaces of school for your children and a religious institution. Now you have, places for food that you can sort of get a variety from. You have places to purchase replacement work uniforms, you know. We call them malls, right? And department stores, right? And you have places to unwind and de-stress, a tavern, a bar, a club. You have
Sports
other,
teams.
and then you have other entities that create greater buy-in
Mm-hmm.
to being in the city, like a sports team, like festivals and events and parks and so forth. So cities, by nature of that, then create the ways in which people become complicit. And one of the ways in which people can become complicit is through engaging in the laundering, right? So either creating mechanisms to launder other people and themselves, or to buy into the process of the cleaning of things, right? And we kind of alluded to it the last time we were um, talking here, which is, especially in the United States, it's interesting that we go through these periods of trying to rename a space, as if that sort of addresses, especially, indigenous sovereignty that, has been completely sort of ignored and disrespected in so many different ways, uh, not recognizing that, about 85% of the places in the United States are corrupted versions of indigenous, you know, words in the first place, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Ohio,
Indiana,
yeah, well, all these places are, which is, wild to sit there and think about. And so the very nature of,
North Dakota. Yeah.
yeah, so just breathing and walking through the United States is a process of laundering just indigenous, land theft, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Because it's like I said, it's the buy-in where the city then becomes, like you talk about, also the city hires the state, but it becomes like this front in and of itself. Because now, like we were talking off air, and I did not intend to bring this up on this episode, but whatever. But like we were talking about the Drake Kendrick beef, not to get into that for for spectacle reasons or whatever, but I'm saying like part of the issue was that Kendrick felt like Drake disrespected his city, as in Los Angeles, another indigenous. Well, that's actually technically Spanish, but but the Spanish took it from the indigenous folks, and then the United States took it from the Spanish, and but but anyway, so but there was a sense of like, oh, this is my city, you disrespected my city. And even though, I'm definitely on the side of Kendrick, and anything against Drake, I'm all for it. But I'm saying that the sense that we feel this affinity to the city, and that this is our city in the West Coast, and we feel that kind of buy-in, like that's kind of what the myth was getting at with this Who's Streets. It's like, this is mine,
right,
and you don't come and disrespect mine. And it's not a criticism of even Kendrick or anybody that does this necessarily, but that demonstrates like that's this kind of like belonging that we feel to these things, because we grew up where we grew up, and we feel a sense of affinity to that. But that often gets washed into all this other stuff. So then you'll see, I don't know if this is going to happen, but we know the Olympics is happening, and Kendrick. And Kendrick standing for LA can somehow set up the Olympics to just displace more poor people or more homeless people, or culture and people who feel an affinity. It happened in Atlanta. Culture can often be brought in. I know we might get to this gentrification, all that stuff. The affinity that people can have for a city, or even in Indianapolis, that kind of we talk about in chapter 1, this sense of belonging to a city, and can often get you to buy into the actual things that launder the rage elsewhere, even if you're doing it for love of the city, for love of your people or whatever, right? Like it has that ability, because like you said, it's not just somewhere where I go to work and go home. I'm supposed to feel all these other things that gets me beyond what's actually happening, like on the material level. I love this place. Like I had my first kiss over here. I remember over there we were at this club. Like, you have all these memories. Like, it's a very human experience, but it has a way of tying you to something, and buying you into something, like you said, that ultimately isn't really working for you, in the way that you might think it is, even if you have all these memories attached to it. Think about people that get mad about school closings, or, when you drive through a neighborhood. I know we've all done it. Like, you remember when this building was there and it's not there anymore, or like the city has that effect on us, right? But ultimately, like, what is despite us maybe having those feelings and the ways that can get us to buy in, like, what is the function of the city, under capitalism? Are the cities our streets? That's my next question.
Yeah, like, wow, yeah, okay. It yeah, I mean, one is it is a good example of the laundering process. So in the sense that here's Los Angeles, and this is a place of the Zoot Suit riots, the Watch riots, LA rebellion, LAPD, and all these types of things that we know has been harmful. The ways in which they have handled the fires, and the issues of water access and so forth, and yet somebody can still want to defend the city as if the city is theirs, as opposed to it being someone else's, and you're just residing in it because you are a necessary part of the labor force to maintain processes of extraction of natural resources, wealth accumulation, that then also leads to then dispossession. So and this happens in so many different places, unless there aren't enough social space creations to sort of create that buy-in. So we see that, in certain places where there are no sports teams, there are no major festivals. And so you have those places trying to do something a little bit, latch on to any little thing. So you
Minor
have
league teams like Indianapolis.
exactly minor league,
Yeah.
college teams, and then
Yeah.
if places don't even have that, then all of a sudden you have high school
Mhm.
football. I mean, like we have to do something, otherwise, the mask, the veneer is stripped away, and all we have is bad roads, bad water systems, no
Price
home loans.
price is too high. Yeah. It's
Right,
the whole
right.
thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, so you can see uh, in what happened at the Staples Center. I refuse to call it,
Yeah, me too.
.com,
Yeah.
not to say that somehow Staples is some better corporate
Yeah,
entity.
but still, it's just like we're
It's
not
just
calling it crypto, man.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so, but the reality is that where is this stadium at? It's right next to what used to be Skid Row, and Skid Row, of course, has been constantly moved farther and farther away.
Mhm.
One that used to be literally right next to what is known as the Staples Center, but because that would be intolerable for tourists and attendees to the games, they've moved the unhoused population farther and farther away, still downtown Los Angeles, but nowhere, in the sort of immediate sort of vicinity. And that's Los Angeles, but that's not the Los Angeles that
That's not what people are claiming. Yeah.
no, and that would not create the ways in which people would want to buy sweatshirts that say Los Angeles, or to champion it in a song or whatever else. And it's the same thing in other particular places. And in relationship to that concert, the converse is also in effect, where the other artist doesn't have any pull in his city in terms of Toronto. And so
The other artists.
yeah, I'm just, it's just, but the other artist, has
Nah, fine. The other artists
yeah,
is fine. We don't need that name there.
yeah,
Uh,
because yeah, because on one hand, um, while Toronto has been excellent in terms of capital generation, it's still developing social systems that can unify an entire city. So it's not just the artist himself would have difficulty in trying to bring people on a comparable stage, because the artist just has no connection. It's also that the city has not had, decades of generating a narrative that would create, all these disparate neighborhoods that have issues with the city and its management of their neighborhoods together, and ignoring how those neighborhoods have been managed onto one place to sort of push their city. I mean, they don't have adequate number of sports teams, and most of their sports teams outside of hockey are very new, you know. Um, their university system has been very much focused on straight academic research areas. So they don't have the type of college sports space in terms of whose streets. It's one thing to have a desire for what you perceive as self-determination, which is, I'm not going to be afraid of um, the streets that the city claims, and the city claims through the police, we're going to reclaim by us being on the street. And we're going to activate the street in the way that we want to activate the street. So, neighborhood block clubs, and, you know, our own pop-up movies in the park and these types of things. And
mhm.
I'm not trying to disrespect people who have
Right,
put
right.
forth, but to, creating that. It's just, our point here is to try to be just critical and try to think deeply. And these aren't our streets just because we walk on them.
Mhm.
If every single person who lived in a city refused to go into their house and went on the street, no matter the numbers of the people, they still don't run those streets. They don't, they can't dictate where a new street is going to be paved. We don't have streets that are just automatically made by residents, right? Mail is not going to, go to that street that residents paved. We can't just go to Home Depot and get, a bunch of concrete and just start making a road, and like we make a driveway. I guess we could do that, but see how long
that lasts.
Way, right? See how long other structures favorably respond to that. Like I said, mail is not coming. Your Uber Eats order is not going to come to that location.
It's not going to exist on the GPS. Like
it's not going to exist.
Nobody will be able to find you.
You'll have no other infrastructure there, like water pipes,
right,
fiber optics, phone lines.
Internet.
You'll just have concrete on an area that you'll have concrete on the area, and you'll have things connected to that concrete on the area. So I'm not saying that's what people are saying when they say who streets, but I'm just saying that is that is a way to sort of articulate and enact who's streets. Like, so if we really are saying we own these streets, well, that would be an expression of ownership of the streets, and there's no way that we would do that. And so so again, I'm not saying that people are playing a game. It's just a way to sort of interrogate how I think we've had conversations before about wealth, how we don't understand, we cannot fathom what wealth is. We think riches and big income is wealth, and like that's not wealth. We think generational wealth is like a reparations check for $2 million, like that can jumpstart generational wealth, and like no, like $2 million.
And even if it was, my thing with that is even if you up that number and dramatically, wealth is seen as, like, even if you think about, okay, I don't know, NBA players, they always talk about they get generational wealth, $300 million contract or something. Like Jason Tatum's gonna get that.
Right.
What's the owner paying? Like, if the owner can pay you that, what are they getting? And I'm just saying, like, what is wealth at the end of the day? Like, when he's coming back to Marx, it's talking about the harnessing of nature, and then the machinery, and then the labor, and that's the means of production that then produces the wealth. Like, and if you don't have that, to me, I don't think any of it's wealth. Like, just like,
if you and I won Mega Millions, and let's say the jackpot was 400 million, and so probably the takeaway portion is 230, 240, right? The cash out. That's a lot of cash. So don't get us wrong. Like, we're not going to have any debt.
No, we're not going to be hurting
at all. And we can hook up, a lot of our friends, people we know, we could probably pay for some pretty good lawyers and deal with the Pendleton 2 case very well.
Yeah, we can get them out tomorrow. Yeah.
but the reason why I brought up that analogy is, for some reason I've been fascinated at looking at these social media influencers on YouTube who look through like the $1 million homes. And when I say $1 million home, I'm talking about like the 40, 60, 100 million dollar homes. So technically, by nature of the amount of money that I said that we won, $230 million, you and I could buy $100 million home. But in our lifetime, we're not going to be able to afford the upkeep for that $100 million home, because the utilities, first of all, for that $100 million home per year is probably going to be like $20,000-$30,000, right? Even with the solar panels, the sheer power to run that sort of location. That's a lot of dusting and lawn mowing and so landscaping, so the sheer number of laborers that we're going to have to pay over a lifetime to keep that up, that's a whole nother thousands of dollars. There's property taxes, and the property taxes go up based upon square feet or acreage, depending upon the size of the place. And so all of a sudden, that extra $120 million that we had with the 220 whatever $1 million, if we dropped $100 million, bought the house, we rich. 10 years from now, we're probably going to be on TV talking about how broke because we lost all our money trying to pay for plumbing, new roofing. A storm came through, a tree fell on a portion of our house.
And we had to sell that house for $10 million.
Right, because, or
when it was $100 million, but we had to sell it for 10 because we couldn't keep it up. Like
exactly,
we couldn't afford to keep it up. Yeah.
So we don't have a concept of wealth, and I'm just kind of use this analogy, and I know some people have talked about, like, if I had $100 million, like I would own part of whatever team, that's not doing well, that it doesn't sell for $1 billion, still sells for $100 million. Like, well, you realize, like, the day that you pay for the team, you had enough money to buy the team, but you had the first month of payment of utilities, staff, and so forth, you don't have any more money because you use all your $100 million just to buy the team. And you haven't created no revenues because you bought the team in the offseason. So there's not like in that month you had a Taylor Swift concert and, and something else to bring in the money. So, so again, we cannot, so the $100 million home and the $100 million purchase of a team requires typically somebody who has at least $1 billion, if not $2 billion, because they have the means to pay the large amounts of money to sort of maintain those things. This is what happens when people are trapped in, when they buy a yacht or trapped into buying a plane. They don't realize, like, they got to pay for hangar fees and docking fees and how much that costs per year, and you're not even using it that much, right? And so I know people who may be listening is like, good Lord, where they're going to all the time with their analogies. But I think what we're trying to do with these analogies is that in thinking about laundering, it is about the accumulation of wealth and the aspiration for the accumulation of wealth, because we buy into laundering not because we want to dominate people and we truly believe in dominating, but the desire to aspire to not be broke anymore becomes such a pull that we move past just like basic bill payment, like no more debt. Now we want to, like, sure up what we have 10 times. And this is why athletes get into, contracts with $100 million, even though they already had two other contracts for $100 million. They just get into another one because they just keep now trying to sure up the last three sure ups, right?
Because it's somewhat of a separate conversation to get into the maintenance of wealth, but it is a point to consider. And a lot of us don't know people with money, so we don't really learn. Like, you don't make $1 million usually and live at a $1,500 a month apartment. That's not,
right.
So, like, because the aspiration of it would making $1 million would be silly. I'm talking about within capitalism. To make $1 million is so I can say I have $1 million. I'm gonna live like I got 1 million, billion, whatever. I'm not gonna make $1 billion or $1 million and still live like I make 50 grand a year. Like, why would I? Well, otherwise I'll just keep making 50 grand a year. Like, I'm just saying so that aspiration drives a lot of things forward in a negative way, I think, but because I'm always thinking about the possibility, maybe possibly so somehow I can get there myself. And also, even if I never do, even if I don't even have the ambition of getting there, I will, and this is where Stuart Hall's work is important, because when I'm talking about the state,
Right.
I see that interest as mine. That's the point that I think we make in the book, as the state being the organizer. The interest of someone to accumulate that much money is in my interest, because I might one day be in that position too, even though I more than likely never will. But the
Yep.
idea that I could, I don't
Right.
want to encumber the ability to do so, because I'm trying to get out of my situation too.
Right.
You
Right.
know, and the
Right.
city has a way of reinforcing that, because you can drive to that side of town, even if it's outside of the city, but you can drive and see, okay, this is what it's like to have $1 million. Like, there's a house that gives me a sense of it. This is also what it looks like to have no money. And that side of the city is very clear, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
or that apartment complex, or all of those things let me know, like, okay, where I can get to. So when we even are looking for places to live or whatever, like, all of the city has a way of like programming that, very materially. That's why when we talk about this book, I always fight to make sure people deal with this chapter, because I think people want to skip it sometimes, because it's like, these are the stuff on a daily that really like helps influence how you even see, even more so than looking at your phone or looking on TV. Like, when you drive around the city, the reality is put back to you constantly.
Right.
Like, it's not, you don't miss it. Uh,
Enough is never enough.
yeah.
And so then you are again always trying to seek ways to, double, triple, quadruple up, so that if anything bad happens, you have backups, right? You
Yeah.
have savings accounts on your savings accounts, right?
Yeah.
Um,
The capitalism, Marx makes that point. It engenders a kind of hoarding, but not always out of a greed, like you just
right,
said. Not always out of, I just don't want to share it because I'm evil or something. But it engenders a kind of hoarding because of the ups and downs, its own like, or its own proclivity to crisis. So we know things can
right,
really crash and burn. But it engenders like, okay, I don't know if this much is always gonna come in. So I'm gonna like hold on to it, either hoard the money literally, or I'm gonna buy a bunch of shit, so I can kind of live the moment. Those are the people that go broke, because
mhm,
that's still a kind of way of hoarding it, like in a reverse way. Like, you're
yeah,
spending all your money, but you're doing it to like get all this other stuff, even if it
right,
doesn't have any real value. So it always engenders that I gotta like capture the moment. That's that whole, get the bag kind of mentality, right? Like, that's what that is. But in the
and
city, you see the results of those, you see the outcomes literally just driving around.
right, and
You know.
so while certain aspects of the state then produces people who are governing the extraction process,
Mhm.
producing the dispossession process, um, the nature of the state also produces then people who have the drive to want to ensure that what things that can shore up their wealth is also going to happen in the city. And so this is then why you have philanthropy in the city in a certain way, sponsorship
Mhm.
in the city in a certain way. You have certain people of a certain level of wealth influencing the politics of a city in a certain way to ensure that the city stays the way they want it to be, so that they can continue to thrive. So if it's not just I'm going to um contribute a lot of my money to build the Lincoln Center in New York. I'm also going to displace people who are around the Lincoln Center and on the Lincoln Center so that I can create the Lincoln Center, but then also enjoy the Lincoln Center. And then we'll find another place in the city and then do something else in that particular city. And then we'll find another place. And so you start terraforming the city, based upon what you want it to be for yourself. But since you have enough means, your ideas aren't just what you share with somebody else in your car in your home. You have enough wealth to then make it so. Either you're paying for it yourself or you're paying for a portion of it, and public funds are coming along with your funds then to make the thing. So you've attracted this particular event, or you've created this sports team, or you've built this stadium, or you've built this park, and so forth. And so the city then becomes then the articulation of the ideas then. So this is beyond then the governance, right? And this is why
Oh,
I
of
think,
course. Yeah.
yeah, so this goes back to then what we're talking about, how thinking about the state beyond government is so important, because you have the governance issues, and then you have then this other whole aspect of certain people wanting the city to be a certain way, and you're in the way because you're not a part of that look that they're wanting, that metal that they're wanting, right? We want our city to be known as, the number one tech center in the world. We want our city to be known as the convention center of the world. We want our city to be known as an international city, right? We, certain, places push that. Sometimes it is people in government that may push it. But then sometimes it may not even be people in government. It may be some, wealthy individuals who are in that city
And
who
like,
are
yeah, and they're all, that's the thing. If the government, we're not saying the government is not part of the state. So the government is definitely like helping
right.
with zoning, or, is giving tax breaks, or, whatever is needed to kind of bring that kind of capital to the area. But it makes me think of Robert Allen, someone else who was deeply influential for the book. When he was talking about the quote unquote black community, but he was talking about corporate imperialism. But you can
Mhm.
see in a way that cities kind of reflect the mindset of capital, like internationally, because cities will divest from an area, and and that place just underdeveloped, just dead, and then they'll put money somewhere else and build up an area to entice capital, right, to come to this place, and then they'll sell it just the way they sell like globalization or anything else, that's going to trickle down to the rest, that's going to raise the living standards and the quality of life for everyone if we can get this industry here, right? Like that's the, and it's not that that's not always on some level true, that there is some people in the city do benefit from an industry kind of like making it their home. But I remember when they were talking about bringing Amazon to Indianapolis, and I was like, no, like part of why we like any part of the city at all is because the price of living is not ridiculous. If
Right.
Amazon brought a hub to Indianapolis, like a lot of us won't be able to live here no more, because like the price of living will go so high, you know. But again, like you can see how cities are many kind of, like you see just how capital goes across the globe and is always looking for the cheapest market to kind of raid. Cities are a microcosm of that. Like, and you can actually drive around and see it. Where are the potholes? Where are they not? Where's the dilapidated buildings? Where are they not? You know, where do people have money? Where do they not? This neighborhood used to have money. Now it doesn't. This neighborhood was middle class. Now it's poor. This neighborhood was poor. Now it's middle class. Like you can see the city, and that's not because Rasul just decides to say, hey, I don't want to live here anymore. And we all just make our little impersonal choices. And that's that, you know, like
Yeah.
it's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
that's the part that I don't think we get about the cities,
No, like 500 to 1,000 corporate Amazon workers in a city like in Indianapolis. And for our listeners, Indianapolis is
8 to 900,000.
8 to 900,000 when you think about the consolidated city, which incorporates what we consider to be certain suburbs as a part of the main sort of city.
Mm-hmm.
It may jump to like just at a million,
Yeah,
or just
yeah.
a bit above a million. Just 500 to 1,000 Amazon corporate workers, not Amazon workers at the distribution center, but the corporate workers,
Yeah.
they would demand different quality either homes or apartments than the current residents, right? And that doesn't mean that they want to pay $2,500 per month to stay at a place, but they want exposed brick. They want, elevators, they want, a 1,000 square foot fitness facility, not the typical 200 square foot fitness facility, in a place. Um, they're going to want Whole Foods as opposed to Needlers or Piccadilly or whatever other type of small grocery chain that are in other types of cities. They're going to want to run and jog and bike at 5 a.m. in their perception of safety. So that means that they're going to demand for a certain type of surveillance system to be instituted on trails. They're going to want a trail, which is going to change the number of spaces for cars on a particular road or street. All this because of just 500 to 1,000 Amazon workers. So this is to your point about, no, like this is why, it would not be a good thing, because that's what's going to happen. It could just be in the downtown part of it, or it could be in all parts of the city, right? Depending upon where that 500 to 1,000 may
It would
choose to
probably
concentrate
be
the most.
it would probably be most of the city, honestly.
Right. But think about it, the fact that here is a place that has 800,000 to again 1 point, maybe 1 million, if we think about the consolidated city being impacted by only 500 to 1,000 people moving there. Another good example that is happening right now in this moment, it should be almost finished up, but the new Nashville, the Tennessee Titans stadium is going to be, I think, $5 to $7 billion. The stadium. So a stadium, a place that is only about, a concession stand, seats to watch a game. You have a $5 to $7 billion, thing that, a thing that we see on a high school or middle school playing field. I mean, stadiums all do the same thing, technically. They just expand in size and what they're offering. So, there may not be any wall art in the high school, middle school stadium, but it's, they may have the spray painting of the mascot on the wall. That's no different than having an original Picasso on the $7 billion sort of wall of the stadium. Stadiums are not doing different things than what stadiums do.
Right.
And yet $5 billion, $7 billion, large amounts of which are public funds, are being put into the Tennessee Titans. Right. We're not talking about the Dallas Cowboys or England Patriots, teams that we know have generated large amounts of revenue based upon their winning streaks and popularity.
Yeah.
Tennessee Titans, right? They're going to have the most expensive NFL stadium out of all stadiums until the next one, outdoes it. And that's for what? It's to attract, to put Nashville on the map internationally for something more than just country music. It's going to put it on a map as a major sporting entity. So it's going to challenge other sporting cities like Indianapolis by nature of having this particular type of thing. And so that means what's across the street from the $5 billion, $7 billion stadium? Well, it's not going to be public housing. Public housing is not going to be allowed to be across the street from it. So that's going to displace public housing, affordable housing. They won't be anywhere near proximate to this particular stadium. So wherever, if it is close, it's going to be moved farther away. It's going to change people's ability to work and get to certain places easier because, of course, game days or concert nights and so on are going to completely restrict travel and transportation. It's going to have an impact on the grid in terms of power and electricity. So these are how these capital projects impact the city. It's not just the financial part of building the infrastructure, it's the people, it's the social space. Again, the notion of a social space creates a social life, and in that social life, or our desire to hold on to that social life, then creates the laundering. And so this is why these things go through, because so many people believe in the sort of myth of what the social, having these improvements, can bring, even though there's no study that has shown that the improved park has revitalized, the true entire city. It's revitalized something.
Right.
But it's not the people who have been most dispossessed. The mega event, the Super Bowl, whatever else, has not revitalized the city, but the stadium has not revitalized. We see these things constantly come up as the desire. The major public art effort has not revitalized, the city, but they still continue to be the main thrust for people to sort of put money into and to rally behind, because most people sort of see it as, success and so forth. So if a mayor builds or supports the building of a stadium or a public art campaign or a major park and so forth, they'll be reelected. But if the mayor just does a great job with the sanitation, right, where there are no rodents and no roaches that are coming into people's homes, that mayor is not going to be reelected.
Yeah, but that's a good point. It makes me also think about when we're talking about laundering. Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore talks about like the point of naming something an industrial complex. It's not just that term gets thrown around all the time for reasons that aren't even really relevant half the time to what people are talking about. But whatever name you want to put in front of an industrial complex, but what she's talking about is the way that there's an entire like industries built around it, and all these different interests converge around this thing, right? So it's not just the boss or capital, it's all of us that like buy into it. So we want to think about like when she talks about prison industrial complex, a lot of people turn that into this concept of profit, which we've debunked on this show, but it's like, no, entire cities have been sold that bringing a prison to their town, city, like small town, is going to improve their life expectancy, or and not life, well, actually it decreases that, but it's gonna improve their general like quality of life. It's gonna provide jobs, all that shit, right? But then we look at the statistics and we see that there's domestic violence rates go up, drug addiction goes up when you bring prisons to these, because working at these places is not usually a fun experience, right? It doesn't actually improve. So, but that idea is easy to sell if the public's not really well informed, because all these ideas, the cities help embed these really false ideas of growth and what really quality of life even is. Like cities have a way of imposing that on you in ways that I just think, especially in this new tech era where everything is online and people just think about what someone tweeted or what somebody said, we really just miss how cities still, to even with hybrid work and all of this, still like are selling us. And even before tech, obviously, and like we deal with in the history of the book, like cities really help sell these ideas of who we are and what is best for us, you know. Like,
Yeah.
so So all that stuff you're saying, like, oh, we need a sports team, and we gotta if we can get this here, then like, yo, we gonna come up. Or I know in Indianapolis had the All-Star game this year. It didn't go well. There weren't good reviews, I should say. But just because the city's not really built to host something on that scale, honestly, so it didn't really work out. But
But
like,
but I mean, sorry, I don't want to break up, you break up your point, but just really quickly too is also we don't understand too what's the demand of an all-star game, right? There's a social space that's more than just a game that's supposed to be provided, and certain cities are incapable of providing that type of social space, right?
including Indianapolis.
Exactly. Like you don't
Yeah,
have clubs that go to 4 a.m., you know, and enough clubs, right?
yeah.
You don't have even the clubs for red carpet treatment, and so you were able to provide the basic infrastructure of the game and hotel places for people to stay, but you weren't able to provide the other things that create that weekend of an all-star game, which is why Las Vegas, worked for the all-star game.
Yeah,
Is
or LA or New York, the cities that we all know, right? Like those cities are
right.
built for that. Yeah.
And it's not and it's not because, something's wrong with Indy. It's just that Indy was never, has never grown to that. And should it, and what we're talking about is tough. It's tough to sort of come to. We don't have an easy answer, because what are we to say to people? No, don't build that $5 to $7 billion stadium. Like, we know that that's a lot of public funds that shouldn't go to that. But some people are also looking at, well, they're not going to, they're not going to build any other opportunity for us to have any type of jobs. So the stadium at least is going to probably hire 5,000 of us doing security, concessions, and so forth. That,
Mhm.
a bigger stadium means more jobs, right? And it's a bad decision. But like, what do we say? What do we say? What do we say?
It makes me think about how it also, we're talking about how it creates a certain aspiration,
Mhm.
but it also like strengthens expectation too. We're talking about
Right.
this affair,
Right.
it strengthens expectation. So you're willing to be like, hey, it's some jobs, or oh, because the idea of what's possible is also shrunk by, well, this is what's coming, and what you talking about is not coming, so I'm gonna take that.
Right.
Like that, like you said, what do you say? Like, all right, I hear you, but you know, like, I could go all day about the city of Indianapolis. I don't want to make this too localized, but I'm just saying, like, there is a way that influences even broader connections the outside of your own city. Like it influences how you understand the rest of the world, and what you think is possible there too, and what you think people deserve and what you think they don't deserve. All right, so yeah, that was that episode. Definitely be check out the next one, or again, if you want to hear the whole conversation, you can listen to it on Patreon. I do also want to shout out, we are with the Pendleton 2 Defense Committee. We're doing a fundraiser for their legal defense fund. So we're gonna leave the link in the chat. There's gonna be an episode sometime in August dealing with all of these things more specifically. But for those who have been longtime followers of the show, Pendleton 2, two political prisoners. Christopher Naim Trotter and John Balaguer Cole here in Indiana, who were sentenced to 200 plus years for saving a man's life against the beating of Ku Klux Klan guards in Pendleton Prison. So there's a fundraiser for that. So particularly if you made it to the end of here, please feel free to donate to that. We're trying to raise at least 20 grand, so we have a long way to go. So please tap in. Other than that, see y'all next episode. Peace out.